Well, away from the politics, it really is all about people. Let's speak to our panel tonight. Ellie Addy is a recipient of PIP and Universal Credit. James Price is a former government senior special advisor and worked for ex-Chancellor Nadeem Zahawi. We're also joined tonight by Megan Thomas, who is the coordinator of the Coalition Against Benefit Cuts. Good evening to you all. Ellie, I'll come to you first because a lot of these changes with the U-turns and the climb downs at the last minute, you know, those currently in receipt of PIP payments and universal credit weren't going to be affected. It would be future claimants. However, you must be breathing a sigh of relief this evening.
Look, I think the climb down on Clause 5 is really positive. We've been campaigning for months now to try to get the government to listen to the fact that the foundation of this bill, the 4-point rule, is fundamentally unworkable, it's unacceptable, it's cruel, and it is positive that the government have backed down tonight, but it's disgraceful that it's come within about half an hour of the bill being voted on. Many MPs didn't know what they were voting on, but have been reassured by the fact that the 4-point bill has been scrapped. We're really concerned that cuts to UC Health are still going ahead. I am someone who is now dependent on universal credit to survive, as well as PIP, after I became really unwell through long COVIDs. I'm really concerned that whilst this is reassuring for myself, my benefits aren't going to be cut now. Other people in my position after the Timms review are going to be completely at the mercy of these cuts, and that's unacceptable. We will not throw future generations of young disabled people and pre-disabled people under the bus just because some of us might be reassured by these measures.
James, can I come to you, former Chief of Staff to the Chancellor Nadeem Zahawi? It's been described as a confusing, chaotic picture tonight. So much happening within the last couple of weeks and within the last couple of hours before that vote went ahead. Some people seeing it as a missed opportunity for what the government billed as landmark reform of the welfare and the benefit system. What do you make of what happened tonight? What have we been left with?
I'll try not to be too political about it, but it does seem like a complete shambles. The Labour Party had an awfully long time to work out what it wanted to do. There's been an awful lot of changes that happened with the welfare programme, especially under the introduction of universal credit. There's an awful lot of money on the line, and it's very serious, as we've heard, about people's livelihoods, people's ability to go to work, to survive, and all the rest of it. And so it does show, I think, the lesson is that politics really does matter, and that for all the kind of throwing around games and all the rest of it, that people's lives can be on the line. I think the principle that, to be fair to Liz Kendall, she said in what felt like a defeat, when you interviewed her just then, we want everybody who can work to work. It's a great thing if you can do it. And if you need some help to do that, you should get that help. And if you can't, there's no one in this country who doesn't think that taxpayers shouldn't pay to help look after the most vulnerable people. But I do think it's fair and right that if taxpayers are paying for that, that there should be some level of checking who it is who gets these kinds of supports and how much they should get. I think it's 3,000 people a day being added to incapacity benefits. That doesn't sound right to me at all. It's a huge number, a growing number, and something isn't right there. And one last point is again, it feels like politics, but it's much more serious than that. If the Labour Party with a massive majority isn't able to get actually quite modest reforms through, as they were unable to today without this kind of massive rebellion, then the markets who lend the government money, because we're spending more money than we're bringing in, they'll take another look at all this, think, actually, at some point, we're going to stop paying for this because there's a big level of fiscal irresponsibility. And that means less money for schools, less money for hospitals, and less money for the disabled people who really genuinely need it. And that could get us into a real economic doom spiral, and nobody should want that.
Yeah, I think we all know money has to come from somewhere, but you know, the big question over this whole debate has been, does that money have to come from the benefit system? Is that really where the axe should fall? Megan Thomas, I'll bring you into this. Disability campaigner. The government, for example, with all these U-turns and chopping and changing at the last minute, said, look, we're doing this because we're listening. But the big question is, have they been listening? Because their own MPs from the backbenches have been talking about this for months and the impact this will have. And there is going to be this review into PIP payments where they say they will listen to those with disabilities. Should they have been listening to them from the start and perhaps not got to this point where the reform we seem to have got is so watered down it's not actually going to make an impact or benefit anyone?
Yes, completely. And as we've seen from the shambles in the Commons today, that the importance of ensuring that welfare reform is co-produced with disabled people and disabled people's organisations from the beginning. If that had been done in this case, we could have avoided all of this. And even within this bill, there is still a lot of people who are going to be affected. So I think it's close to like 700,000 recipients of the health element of universal credit who are estimated to be affected by this bill. And even now, we still don't know, with all of the last minute concessions, we don't know the exact number of people who are going to be impacted. So, for example, they have removed clause 5, but I don't think they've said anything about schedule 2, which would mean that in Northern Ireland, the 4-point rule still remains, but not in the rest of but not elsewhere in the UK. And so it just shows that disabled people need to be involved in the beginning.
Yeah, it does feel like we've been given an answer, but it's posed more questions, and a lot of questions still haven't been answered by that answer. It all feels very back to front and confusing. I did ask Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, whether the benefit system is fit for purpose, because from the government's point of view, they're saying, look, we cannot afford it to continue in its current guise. We have to streamline it. We have to make it work harder for people, and we have to save money. And James, perhaps you can give us a bit of an insight into just the sort of weight and the money involved in the benefit system and why it needs reform. The government will say it's not all about saving money, it is about reform and making that money work harder and better for people who need it.
Yeah, so the benefits bill, the Department for Work and Pensions budget is the biggest in government. About half of it is for state pensions and public sector pensions and things like that. The other almost half or so, we're talking upwards of £140 billion a year, goes to working age people and to children who need it. That's a really large amount of money. It's about, I think, 10% of GDP. So if you can make even quite modest efficiencies and savings and doing things better there, that counts for an awful lot compared to much smaller budgets. And, in context, we are borrowing a huge amount of money every year, and we're paying something like £90 billion. So getting on for what, 2/3 or more of the overall benefits bill just to service our debt interest payments. And we're spending a lot more money on that debt interest payment than we're even spending on things like defense. And you guys report very well about how much more dangerous the world is getting. So to put a bit of context there, and of course, every pound that is spent in this budget that is spent poorly on someone who is maybe messing around with the system or something like that, it reduces the support from taxpayers for the system. And crucially, it's a pound that someone who really needs it isn't able to get. And that's what we want. We want people who need the kind of money to survive and to thrive and to work and to live to get it. But the people who it seems like after coronavirus in particular and the lockdowns who don't need it, and there are stories of people messing around, the government has its own fraud figures on these sorts of things as well. And of course, there are other areas where it was uncovered by a Conservative MP recently that about £12 billion a year, so a great big chunk, way more than the government was even proposing to save on this bill today, is going to foreign people living just on benefits in the UK. So if you got rid of that, you wouldn't need to worry about any of this at all, about 2.5 times over. So it's really, really big money here. And the only way out of it is, I think, probably, if you're not going to be able to cut these things, is economic growth. So you've got more money to do all the things you want to do. And yet, to be slightly political, the Labour Party seems desperate to stop any kind of economic growth with its other policies as well. So we're in a lose-lose situation.
I really want to talk about that messing around with the system with Megan, the accusations that there are people abusing the welfare system. It'd be interesting to hear from Megan on that. But I want to come to Ellie, because, Ellie, you touched on your experience there. You were, diagnosed with long COVID. You cannot work and you can't see a point at which you are able to enter work. So, as you said, PIP and universal credit is a lifeline for you. And I was really touched earlier on today. It made me think Labour MP Dr Marie Tidball, as one of the few visible physically disabled MPs, stood up to speak, on behalf of those with disabilities against this bill. And for you, you have a chronic condition. It's not a visible disability. And I just wanted to get your viewpoint, because often those without visible disabilities have the hardest time when it comes to being assessed. Can you talk about your experience? Because that was a real concern for you here with any changes coming in, that it would affect those with chronic conditions.
Yeah, I think this bill has been completely designed to be able to save money by cutting out people like me who have chronic or fluctuating conditions, suffer with severe mental illness, for example, and for that reason score widely across a wide range of questions. The government's kind of killed that conversation now by dropping clause 5, but there's still so many other harmful elements of this bill that we need to challenge. The reason the conversation has been so fixated around the 4-point rule is because it's so clearly ridiculous, and it highlights the fact that this government is using it as a cost-saving measure rather than a real solution for how the benefit system could be improved. I had to access the benefit system last year when I was in the worst state of my life. I've never felt more mentally or physically unwell. I'm actually still waiting for a long COVID diagnosis. I'm on a 59-week to see a neurologist, and so much of my problems have been caused by not being able to access the healthcare that I deserve over the last decade. I truly believe that if I'd got that support, then I wouldn't be in this position and I might be able to work at the moment. I truly, truly hope that I will be able to in the future, but that's impossible when our public services are literally on their knees. There are so many solutions that the government could take in terms of finding the money and not from cutting money from disabled people. And that is why we will categorically oppose this bill and continue to fight against it. We will not accept any cuts to disability. They are a lifeline. And in a cost of living crisis, it is unacceptable that we continue to see this as something that can be pushed through. There are a number of taxes that could be used. A 2% tax on assets over £10 million would raise £24 billion. It's a very, very simple solution that doesn't come from killing disabled people.
I can see James shaking his head there. Perhaps you can explain why you're shaking your head at that idea of, taxing those who are wealthy further, essentially.
Well, we're already seeing a huge number of rich people leaving the country. We're seeing people who are billionaires and millionaires taking all their money and all their investments out, which means you can't tax them anymore. We're already seeing, frankly, as well, just people of average salaries leaving, people moving to other countries, whether it's America or Italy or the UAE, where somewhere like the UAE, they're not taxed at all. You might think that's wrong of them. You might think it's unpatriotic not to stay and suffer ever greater wealth taxes on money that they own or they've earned, because it should be being redistributed. But the fact is that people are leaving, and they're leaving in ever higher numbers because of the policies coming in. So those kind of figures, whilst statically might be true, in the real world, I'm afraid they won't raise the kind of money that Ellie is talking about there.
OK, I want to bring a final point to Megan. It was that point that James brought up about people messing around in the system, because that's always talked about. When we talk about reform, it's about tightening up the system so people can't abuse it. What's the truth behind that? How many people do abuse the system? Because that's always the argument, and the shouty argument that's talked about when it comes to people on benefits, that there are those that abuse it that make it worse for those who really need it.
The truth is that it's a smokescreen, or we see it as an excuse or a justification to make devastating cuts, which could force hundreds of thousands of people into poverty. When you look at the actual figures around abuses of the benefit system, and also the cost of abuse of the benefit system, the levels of fraud are actually very low, and some of the extremely intense measures that are being put into place in order to kind of prevent fraud cost more than the actual level of benefit fraud that we see. So when, as part of a delegation that went to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Disabled People last year to present on the experiences of disabled people in the UK, and they found the UK to be in grave and systemic violation of the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, partially in large part because of how terrible the welfare system is here. And one of our issues with the bill, and the argument about fraud in general, is that we don't see it as really coming from a place of wanting to genuinely reform the welfare system to actually support disabled people, but also that this bill strengthens some of the worst parts of the pre-existing welfare state.
Megan Thomas, really good to talk to you tonight. James Price as well, and Ellie Adey, thank you for your contribution to this discussion about the welfare bill, the controversial welfare bill, which has been voted through by MPs tonight in a very different form to how it started out, not just last week, but at the start of today. Thanks so much.